That's a lot of pressure there. It's really good to be here. Southern California, I'm from Michigan, so Southern California lives in our imagination as this special place, paradise, somewhere out here on the West Coast, and it's not supposed to ever be cloudy. So, yeah, unfortunately, I feel right at home since it's kind of cold and gray. What an amazing place this is, and I'm so glad that you're here. I'm so glad to be here. Where do I want to start? Brandon said something funny that I was part of one of the fastest growing churches in America. This is true, but then it also was one of the fastest shrinking churches in America once we started telling the truth. So that's what happens, and I think that's an important sort of ingredient in my own story and also in something more global. I don't know if you know who Joanna Macy is. She's a scholar, a Buddhist scholar, and an activist for environmental stuff. She's in her late 70s now. Amazing human being. Really tried to bring actually the terror and horror of nuclear power to the forefront in the 1970s. Like, look at what we're putting in the ground, besides just the weapons that we were making. But anyway, she says two things I think are worth maybe noting right at the beginning. She says we're going through what she calls the great turning, and sometimes she calls it the great unraveling. And she says it's hard to know which is true. It's probably that both are true. We're going through a massive turning of worldview, and it also feels like a massive unraveling. And what's unraveling? Well, institutions are unraveling. Even the church as an institution and all its various manifestations is unraveling in many respects. Our economic systems, our justice systems, they all seem to be, the center doesn't seem to hold right now. And it also feels like a turning, like the soil is being turned up. And it's actually like communities like this, who I think, in a very behind-the-scenes way, are sitting right in the center of this great turning and saying, yes, the world is changing massively, but can we be agents for change and transformation, for truth and beauty and goodness and something on the other side of this massive change? But here's the problem among like 1,000. I'll just mention one problem. During periods of anxiety, personal anxiety, social anxiety, if you watch the news, you better be anxious. You know that ticker at the bottom of the screen? Like alert, alert, alert. I don't care what kind of news you watch. It's just like a constant flood of, here's why you should worry. Here's some anxiety. And no wonder we turn the channel and want to watch like The Voice or something, just to try to lower that. But during periods of anxiety, even if we are growing, like I loved that little video, growing into a sense of who we are, or true self, that's a Jungian term, or Thomas Merton used it too, the true self. The problem is all of the stuff that's underground starts to come out, and it's messy. So you might have, your ideas might be changing, but all of your junk also gets stirred up at the same time. So even being like, I lived in Israel for a few years, and I have friends who are big time into social justice things in Israel. And these people are doing incredible work in dangerous places, and they're also personally a wreck. The way to cope with it is at the bar, generally speaking. And I don't mean that in even a judgmental sense. I just mean in periods of anxiety, even when the truth is growing, all of our stuff gets dragged to the surface. Do you know what I'm talking about? So communities like this, and I think personally, I feel this in my own life, I feel a sense of calling toward personal wellness or wholeness. And we can no longer live these fragmented lives where one part of us is like this and the other part is like this. The call is toward integration, and that's where all the hard work is. I was listening to this lecture once, and it was about meditation, and the teacher was talking about it, and a student raised her hand and was like, "Hey, I'm struggling in my meditation practice. I'm not able to get up to the 4 or 5 hours of meditation that I really want to sort of work toward it." And he said, "You probably just need to go for a run," which is like such funny advice. Like, oh yeah, I need some balance in my life. I need to pay attention to what I'm eating. I need to pay attention to, am I living under a massive debt? All like what I call ordinary. In fact, the end of my book here, Bitten by a Camel, I have a chapter in here. I better check the chapter title in case I get it wrong. By the way, when you write a book, you forget about that you said all this stuff. So you have to look back. Anyway, maybe it's just a theme near the end of the book, but I talk about cultivating a spirituality of ordinary mystery. That's a phrase I like. A spirituality of ordinary mystery that actually comes down at many times to doing the dishes. It really does. And when you live a more integrated and whole life, just on the level of the ordinary stuff, you can actually do really tremendous things in the world. Big things. Things you can barely dream up in your waking world. In other words, there's a parallel track. There are two parallel tracks. One, I think, has to do with wholeness, and the other has to do with your soul. And I like old-fashioned words like soul. I know people get sick of hearing them. But I like soul, and I like it in the old Greek sense of the word, which has something to do with destiny. That you are here to do something, to be a presence in the world, and that's part of your destiny. And it's even bigger than your ego knows anything about. But your capacity to live into that destiny very much is tied to how whole you are. Amen. And all of the stuff that gets dragged up, I'll give you some archetypal images. The wounded child, the victim. These are all like inner capacities that get dragged up. How many have felt like a victim in your life? Yeah, and there's probably good reason for that. But it also can become the very thing that you over-identify with that keeps you small. You know what I'm saying? Okay, here's something else that gets dragged up. What I call the loyal soldier. I write a bit about it in the book. There's a interesting Native American story. I'll just give you like a tiny story. Story of a mouse, okay? And this mouse kept hearing this roaring in his ears. I kept wondering, what is that noise? And he'd ask people. He'd say, hey, what is that roaring in the ears? And they say, we don't know what you're talking about. He's like, no, I hear it. You can't hear that? They're like, get back to work. Keep gathering, whatever you gather is my seeds. Keep gathering stuff. Quit complaining. Set your alarm. Get back to work. He tried to get back to work. He kept hearing the roaring and roaring. He asked everyone in the village, and they all told him, you're crazy. You don't know what you're talking about, until one day he had the courage to leave the village, and he meets a raccoon. The raccoon says, what are you doing out here? He says, I hear a roaring in the ears, and everyone tells me I'm crazy. And the raccoon says, oh, I know about this roaring. I'll show you where it's coming from. And then that's the beginning of the adventure, by the way. I won't tell you anymore. You can read it. Google that. It's called Jumping Mouse. What I love about that story is that when the true self, and we could have a whole conversation on what that is, but let's just leave it at that. When the true self starts to wake up, there are all kinds of voices that tell you, shut up, pick up seeds, get back to work. We don't know what you're talking about. And those can come externally, like voices in your life that tell you, get back to work. They can also come internally. And those are the harder ones to deal with. Those voices that say, stay small. That way you'll be safe. Don't step out into the world. It's going to be dangerous. And guess what? The loyal soldier voice is right. It's going to be dangerous, and you might get hurt. But eventually you get to the place you say, at what cost? At what cost? What ends up going back to sleep is the true self never steps forth into the world. And that's a much greater loss than the dangers that the loyal soldier is sort of screaming about somewhere in the back of your head. So, am I making any sense to you? All right. Oh, I love an amen. I haven't heard that in a long time. Yes. By the way, amen is a Hebrew word or a Jewish word. uh, and all it means is may it be so. And I like that. I like that. May it be so. I really hope this is true is what amen means, which is great. Okay, so let's talk about wholeness just really briefly. Let me look at the time. All right. So if I'm going to talk about wholeness, I might as well mention a little something about the ego. And if you're kind of into spirituality kind of stuff like me, the ego gets a bad rap. Everybody says, oh, that's the ego. The ego needs to get out of the way. You've heard this sort of thing before? I'm not saying that's not true. But one thing I will say is that no one lives without ego. It's impossible, because what is it? It's the very tip of an iceberg, and that very tip is called your conscious self. It's who you think you are at any given moment. That's all the ego is. Your conscious, waking self, who you think you are. The problem is, people over-identify with this tip of the iceberg, and they strut around saying, I know who I am, not realizing the massive underwater, iceberg that is beneath the surface. And any part of growing up involves some measure of some deep sea diving beneath the water level. What is under there, we would say. And what is under there is both scary and beautiful. There are wounds, and the other side of those wounds are also gifts. But the ego wants to just remain in charge. Like, there's nothing under there. Don't look, I know who I am. And of course, I don't know what your political views are necessarily. I'm guessing because it says progressive in the subtitle of Mission Gathering, you're probably not the biggest fans of Trump. Let's just take Trump, I don't know him, I've never met him personally, as an image for one who's over-identified with who he thinks he is. Other words, the ego. There is actually stuff beneath the surface. But when you live so long identifying, I know who I am and I'm right and everybody else needs to bow to my demands, it becomes pathological after a while. And that seems to be what is being mirrored back to us. I'm about to say I like the fact that Trump is a president. I like this about it. It is like a giant mirror for our culture. It really is. It's mirroring back to us a lot of our own darkness, a lot of the stories that we've been telling ourselves for a long time. And so in that sense, it's an opportunity to change. But here's the bad news. Gandhi says, be the change you want to see in the world. So I can spend a lot of time complaining about someone over there and miss out on the inner work. So anyway, sounds like I'm preaching to the choir, which feels good. All right, so what was I saying? Ego. Now, beneath that, let's talk about wholeness just in two respects. First, let's talk about a phrase that I like to use, which is original goodness. You've probably heard of original sin, yes? Anyone know where that comes from? The 4th century, somewhere around there, 3rd, 4th century, it starts to become used. Starts to gain some steam, really through a dude named Augustine. St. Augustine wrote a lot of really interesting things. One of them that probably wasn't all that helpful, in my opinion, was the notion of original sin. There was an argument, and Western Christianity came down on the side of that human beings, in their essence, are a problem to God, just by virtue of being alive. Now, my opinion is that has done tremendous damage to human beings over time. To be told who you are just by virtue of being born in this world is a problem to God. I do want to say that's not the only message inside Christianity. That's Augustine and then Western Christendom that sort of gets built on his back. That's being undone. That's really good news. And so if you're going to talk about wholeness, I think it's first important to mention such a notion of original goodness. There needs to be some theological recovery of this very idea, which is who you are by virtue of the fact of being alive is a beautiful thing. Amen. It's not a problem. I mean, would you want to like serve a God that had such a view? Like everyone who's alive, I can't look at, I can't deal with, is a problem, unless they jump through the right hoops. Then I'll pay attention to who they are. That doesn't really sit well with many of us anymore. And so that's a good thing. So I think it's important to mention your essence is good. It's a gift. It does mean you're a little messy. I'm not going to lie about that. Maybe original messiness might be more true, but you're not a problem to God. That's what I would say. Number 2, with wholeness, has to do with capacities. There's a psychotherapist named James Hillman. I get them confused because there's a James Hillman and a James Hollis, and they're both Jungian psychoanalysts and both authors. So I get them confused all the time. James Hillman says something funny. He says, there are 100 years of psychotherapy, 100 years of psychotherapy, and we're sicker than ever. 100 years, and he's in the business. So that statement, along with some things that have been happening over the last 20 years, I think is a really good observation. Here's what psychotherapy started off doing. Let's identify your darkest problems, and we're going to attack them. Now, the problem is when you sit week after week in the chair, and I'm a fan of therapy, I'm in therapy myself, but when you sit there week after week and all you look at is your junk, you tend to over-identify with that as your major story. So what has been shifting in recent years it's kind of a bad term, I don't really like it, is positive psychology. And that has to do with wholeness. What are your capacities as a human being that have to be pursued in every direction that will in fact help you with your hang-ups and issues? And so original goodness, your essence is already okay. The second question is, what about your original capacities? What capacities do you already have that have to be pursued and cultivated and cared for so that you can live a more whole and healthy life? That's the invitation of sort of positive psychology and the sort of spirituality I'm talking about. What kinds of things I'm talking about? What do you eat? What's your schedule like? Do you take care of your body? What about your relationship with the wild and natural world? I sometimes think that one of the reasons why we feel so sick in our culture is because we have what is now an official term, nature deficit disorder. It sounds funny, but it's a real thing. What's your relationship like with the natural world? Do you feel at home in the wild world? Is something of the wild world mirroring back to you something that's good and whole? I mean, after all, you are nature. I love when people say, I'm not really into nature. How can that be? You're made of it, you know? There's not a separation. So these are part of our capacities as human beings. What's your capacity as a parent? You may or may not be a parent, and I don't mean it that way. I just mean a nurturing, generative adult presence in the world. We have basically a toddler psychologically leading the country. What we need are adults, you know? We do. But that's on you, and that's on me. What are those innate inner qualities for me to be the nurturing, generative adult in the world? What about the sage? Now I'm using archetypes. The sage or the muse, the creative one that lives in there. All that stuff is available to all people. And that's just part of the humble realization that we're in, I think, right now, which is we're called to cultivate these capacities, which is a very humble way of proceeding. It's maybe a better word for it is it's humiliating. We want to go around saying the problem is we don't have adults in our culture, or I wasn't raised by adults. Some of you probably feel that about your parents. I was raised by a child in a sense. I agree, and that creates a lot of wounds. And at a certain point, the invitation is for me to be the adult in my life. That's right. For me to pick up that wounded child that never was picked up. That's where the hard work is. So anyway, that's part, I think, of the invitation that is before us. All right, let me, I'm just looking at the clock. It's time for me to wind down. All right, what do I want to say? What do I want to say? I'll give you one story from the Bible. And this, I do have a study Bible. It's right here. The NIV study Bible, now available after the service. This interpretation is not in there, I don't think. But I thought about it this morning. There's a story in the Gospel of John where a man is laying by the pool of, I think, Bethesda, or Bethesda is what it's called in Hebrew, the pool of mercy. And it says he's been laying there for 38 years. It's a long time. Long time to be next to the pool. And Jesus, who now has a reputation as a healer, is in town. And he says to this man who's been there, let me just remind you, for 38 years. He says, what's the problem? What's the deal? He says, here's the quote. He says, every time the water is stirred, they had some kind of belief that there was a relationship between healing and the stirring of this water. Every time the water is stirred, no one will help me get down in the water. Okay? Now, let's just think for a moment. You're telling me for 38 years, he couldn't come up with a plan to help him get in the water. 38 years? And what is his dominant story? No one will help me. No one will help me until he becomes a broken record. Now, in contemporary psychology, we would call that a victim. Over-identifying with the victim narrative. It is true that he's not well. It is true that no one has helped him get down in the water, but now this is his dominant story. And you know what's funny about the Gospel of John? All Jesus said to him is, take up your mat, and the guy stands up. Now, you could call that a miracle, and maybe it was, like in the sense of something was wrong with him. It could have been the first invitation to break with this story that no one will help me. And that's all it says. And he picks up his mat and walks. That's called empowerment. Jesus didn't just go around helping people. He went around empowering them. His disciples, right away, Jesus says, now you go do it. You go heal. You go teach. You go be this presence in the world, because I'm not going to be here very much longer. And that kind of empowerment and personal responsibility is at least part of how I think it's important to think about wholeness. So I hope you heard something in, my little ramblings this morning. Thank you so much for inviting me. Come check out why go to Israel now more than ever. I say it's important to open our eyes and hearts to this part of the world. So thank you so much for listening, and thanks for having me. Appreciate it.